Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Jeff Gedman. I'm President and CEO of the Legatum Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. And we are live streaming, so to the audience that's not able to be here live at Charles Street in the flesh, welcome to you as well. I'm advised to advise you, because of the live streaming, mobile phones on silent, please. If you want to join the conversation on Twitter, you have Legatum INST or CF Entrepreneurs. And that is because today the Legatum Institute conducts or convenes this program in cooperation with the Center for Entrepreneurs. We've got a fabulous conversation lined up for you today. You're going to hear from, on my right, Gunilla Carlsson, who until just recently, mid-September, was Swedish Minister for Development, a prolific writer, thinker about the issues we're going to talk about today, champion of entrepreneurship. Welcome, Gunilla. Glad you're here with us. To my far left, Guy Rigby, who is partner and head of entrepreneurship at Smith & Williamson. Welcome, Guy, and we look forward to hearing from you. But to lead us off is Reuben Abraham. Reuben is a friend of the Legatum Institute, an alumnus of our summer school. He is formerly with the Indian School of Business, currently head of urbanization, and a partner at the IDFC Foundation, among other things. He is a global fellow at the Legatum Institute, and he's written a terrific paper for us. The paper is titled Learning by Doing, Entrepreneurship in Developing Countries, available on our website, and if you're here today, physical copy as well. Reuben, thank you for writing this paper. It's a terrific read. It's very clear. It's very succinct. We're going to invite you, if I may, to lead us off with 15, maybe 20 minutes of comments.
Sure.
You have some slides, provoke us, anger us, stimulate us, puzzle us, and then we're going to have a great round of conversation. But Reuben, welcome.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for showing up as well. And thanks to the Legatum Institute for supporting this work. So I want to basically break this down into two sections. The second part will be based actually on the stuff that we've done. But the first part is actually a series of puzzles that were thrown up by the work that we did. And though it says IDFC Foundation now, I used to be in academia until 2 weeks ago. And I'm now a reformed academic. But what we were really doing was we were marrying research and practice and sort of experimenting with theory on the ground and see how it sort of turned out. So the first section, I just want to talk about why entrepreneurship matters. And it may be obvious to many, but for some reason you always get this pushback, so I think it needs to be stated that entrepreneurship creates wealth. And if you're interested in the issue of economic development, at the end of the day, you cannot redistribute poverty. You can only redistribute wealth. Now, if you look at countries like India, which is where I'm from, for 50 years we tried the experiment of redistributing poverty. Didn't turn out too well. So we've gone on this reform path where we've basically said, okay, maybe what we need to do is create a lot of wealth and then use that money to basically bring down poverty. So that's where we're starting from, and here I think it's just useful to look at the example of China, which many of you may have problems with the political system of China, but it's worth looking at the numbers. This is basically the percentage of people living on less than $1.25 a day in China, and it's 1981 to 2009. And if you can see, 84% of the population of China used to live in absolute poverty in 1981. That number has been brought down to 11.8%. So as I said, I mean, irrespective of what you think of China's political system, you cannot deny this humongous achievement that the Chinese have pulled off. And China, by the way, was, and so the 1981 pretty much correlates with the reforms that Deng Xiaoping sets in motion in 1978 after the third plenum of the party. So he was in turn inspired by the examples of Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. And the next slide, I just want to basically show you what happens between 1960 to 2011. If you notice, 1960 to 1970. So what I've done here is I've taken the examples of Kenya, Ghana, Bangladesh, and then North Korea, and compared it to Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. And what you see is basically most of them sort of start off at the same point, and then there's this dramatic divergence that happens, starting in about 1970. So people look at this. So for instance, again, when we talk to policymakers in India, for instance, people look at this and they will tell you, for instance, so the argument typically amongst policymakers is that countries are sui generis. So what has happened in Singapore or Taiwan or Korea cannot be replicated in a democracy like India. So that is typically the argument that is made, that this is a different form of government, so therefore you were able to do reforms that actually worked, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as it turns out, if you look at, so that holds if you look at national level data, but if you actually drill one step down and look at subnational level data, you'll actually find that the exact same rules hold. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to compare, and this is a bit tricky, this is the states of Uttar Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh in India. And the reason I've picked these two states is because both of them are humongous states. So Uttar Pradesh has a population of 200 million, which makes it larger than Brazil. And Andhra Pradesh has a population of about 85 million. So these are very, very large states. And I've also looked at rural versus urban poverty. And I'm looking at this because typically when you show these kind of numbers in aggregate, people say that, well, it's only the urban players that have actually benefited, not the rural players. Now, as it turns out, if you actually look at it, this is a comparison 1993 to 2012, urban and rural. You see this very sharp drop in poverty in Andhra Pradesh, as opposed to Uttar Pradesh. And again, what happens here is that there's a young technocratic politician who comes to power in 1993, sets up these very serious liberal reforms within the government. And what you see as a consequence is the effect of those reforms. So, I mean, if we have time, I can go into details on what those reforms look like and so on. So, if you look at subnational data, you will find this pattern. And you'll find this pattern repeating itself in other countries as well when you look at subnational level data. Look at regions with better governance, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the interesting question here to ask is, what is the trigger? Right? And to me, it's almost, this is the central question of economic development. So what did Singapore and Taiwan and Korea and all of these places do, which some of these other players did not? And so there's a whole host of reasons that are, that people talk about. So for instance, you've got culture and religion, which was once offered as a response, but since the growth of Japan in the early 20th century, that was disposed. Then you had issues like literacy and healthcare. So if you follow Amartya Sen's argument, for instance, that's the argument that he pushes down, which is that if you need a certain amount of literacy for this takeoff to happen. Well, I have no objection to that, except it doesn't actually show up in the data. So if you look at 1960 as a trigger point for Taiwan and Korea, what you'll basically see is Taiwan had a literacy rate of 54%, and Korea had a literacy rate of 71%. China in 81 has a literacy rate of 64%. India in 91 has a literacy of 53%. This just doesn't correlate at all. Now, what you typically see is once you have growth, you basically have governments that invest heavily in education and healthcare and so on. But per se, what is the takeoff coming from? It doesn't show up in the data when you look at literacy. Now, the only sort of argument that I think that I've heard, which I think merits discussion, is the one around geography. But even that, has been sort of now disproved, because you look at North Korea and South Korea, you look at Burundi and Rwanda. There's all these strange things that are happening where people, same culture, same people, same geography, but you have very different kinds of growth rates happening. So the question then becomes, what is going on, right? I mean, and there seems to be no particular answer that's convincing. So all I was doing was, and I looked at a whole bunch of these countries, and not just the Asian countries. And the only thing that I can find which correlates is actually what I call political entrepreneurs. And I call them entrepreneurs because they're actually willing to invest significant political capital to take risk to disturb the existing equilibrium. So whether that's Deng Xiaoping, that's Park Ji-hung, that's Lee Kuan Yew, that's Narasimha Rao, or in the case of Andhra Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, the young Chandrababu Naidu in these countries, or in India at a large level, Narasimha Rao. So what happens is these outlier political entrepreneurs show up. And the funny thing here is we have no theory around this. Most of the insights on where, So for instance, I mean, even if political entrepreneurs show up, is Mao Zedong a political entrepreneur? So how do you ensure that what shows up is good as opposed to bad? What if Mao Zedong had showed up in Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew had shown up in China? What would outcomes have looked like? So we don't really have a proper theory, and most of the insights on this are actually coming out of psychology, on the mind of this person. We don't have anything in economics, for instance, that actually addresses where do good leaders come from. So how, when, where, or why? Where do these guys show up? No clue. So this is actually a very interesting puzzle for me, which I think merits a lot more discussion. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but worth thinking about. So to extend that, when you talk about entrepreneurship per se, we have a little bit more of an idea, though again, if you actually drill into the details, what you basically see is the same story repeating itself. We don't have too much of an idea of how, when, where, or why entrepreneurs come from. What you typically know is that there are ecosystems that matter, and you also, if I had to pick a generic rule that holds across countries, across regions, is any region that significantly decreases the cost of failure tends to have a lot more entrepreneurship. So the interesting passage that I have here is, from Carrie McWilliams, who wrote a book called California, the Great Exception. And this is worth listening to, because when I say ecosystems, I don't mean just rules. I also mean norms, the norms around entrepreneurship. So Carrie McWilliams makes this very interesting point. He says, Californians have got so used to the idea of experimentation. They've had to experiment so often that they are psychologically prepared to try anything. Experience has taught them that almost anything might work in California. For over 100 years, California has provided a template for tinkering like no other place on the planet. And this in turn has changed the definition of what's acceptable as a social norm, created a new class of role models, made it acceptable to fail and fail again, and increases the acceptance of diversity and wild ideas. So that's sort of broadly speaking the first section of what I wanted to talk about, and we can engage in a broader discussion around this. The second section is about entrepreneurship in developing countries. But before we even go there, I just want to start by saying we need to be clear about what we mean when we say the word entrepreneur. And I think in developing countries, there's broadly speaking 3 types of entrepreneurs. The first is what you and I would call the classical entrepreneur, the Steve Jobses, the Narayana Murthys, the, what's his name, Alibaba. So I'm forgetting his name now. So it's these grand scale entrepreneurs who build great companies, create thousands of jobs, etc. The second one, which is an unheralded entrepreneur, which is the entrepreneur who actually creates small and medium business, which is not always talked about in discussions of entrepreneurship. And here it's just worth looking at it purely from a job creation standpoint, as in where are the majority of jobs created? And so we have some data on this in OECD countries, and this is what you'll see. The data is very clear. In most OECD countries, most jobs are created by the SME sector. And so in Europe, on average, the creation of jobs is over 90% of all jobs are created in the SME sector. Now, the major caveat here, keep in mind, is that the SME sector cannot exist absent the large companies, because a lot of them are creating the supply chains for large companies. The third bit, which is really what I want to focus in on, is what I call survival entrepreneurship, where survival can be misdiagnosed as entrepreneurship. And this is crucial in this discussion, because a person selling tea by the roadside can very easily be misdiagnosed as an entrepreneur, when in fact, all he's trying to do is survive. It's a job. A well-functioning society would do well to promote the first 2 kinds of entrepreneurship and eliminate the third kind of entrepreneurship, so that that third layer, the survival entrepreneur, can actually be absorbed into the first and second kinds of entrepreneurship. So the reason I make this distinction is because it's important from a policy standpoint to know which type of entrepreneurship you're actually trying to encourage. So here again, one interesting way of thinking about survival entrepreneurs is to think about intent versus lack of options. I would argue that an entrepreneur, as we understand the word entrepreneur, is somebody who's there by intent. as opposed to the survival entrepreneur who's there because he has no option. So what I've done here is I did an analysis, this is just a random analysis of my students. So this is basically India's premier business school. They have access to everything you want, networks, cash, they've got access to everything. So here's what I found. Until today, 4,966 students have graduated from the program. 300 of them have tried to be entrepreneurs, of which 12 have companies that have revenues of over $1.5 million, and 2 have companies with revenues of over $15 million. So the point here is, if entrepreneurship is such a rarity amongst the elite and the more significantly privileged piece of the population, why would you assume that you can have a lot more entrepreneurship at the lower end of society? And yet, and this is the unfortunate consequence of the celebration of the microfinance movement, is this notion that everybody can become an entrepreneur. They cannot. And this is very important to make this distinction. So if you think about barriers from an entrepreneurship perspective, I would say that barriers, broadly speaking, can be bucketed into 5. And those are regulatory and policy. And a friend of mine puts it brilliantly when he says that regulation can very often create a system which promotes dwarfs rather than babies. They both look alike, but one is a dwarf, the other is a baby. The baby grows, the dwarf stays. So that's one way to sort of think about the model. The second is access to finance, debt, equity. You have a problem across the board. Access to markets, access to knowledge networks, technology, all of those things. And finally, access to talent. Whether you are at the top end of whether you're looking for high-end talent or low-end talent, there's a real problem in developing countries. Now, if you think about the entrepreneur for a second, in the ideal world, the entrepreneur should be arbitrage. So if you think of what I just described as inefficiencies, the entrepreneur should be able to arbitrage each and every one of these inefficiencies, right? I mean, so a lot of us who work in this space think of mispriced risk, for instance, which is the difference between the perception of risk versus the reality of risk. Now, the fact of the matter is, if that is actually true, then the entrepreneur, there should be some entrepreneur somewhere who can actually arbitrage this inefficiency. So, but you don't actually often see it. So the question is, what is going on? And my hypothesis here is that the underlying assumption here is that we take market clearance as a given. So the question to ask here is, what if market clearance is not a given, and is not a given for a variety of problems, asymmetric information, credit constraints, government policy. There's a variety of reasons why the market may not clear. So then the question is, do you need a nudge? And if you need a nudge, what form should that take? Should that take the form of long-term capital? Should it take the form of extremely well thought out research? Should it take the form of better government policy? What is the nudge that is actually required? Now, the other thing that I'd add here is, and based on, you can actually see this play out, which is investors, certainly in the large developing countries, make their investment decisions based on availability of information and the flavor of capital. So if your back end is a pension fund in California, then you will take a series of decisions that may not be correlated with the availability of opportunity. So, so therefore, the consequence of that is that they're likely to invest in businesses that they understand better, which is basically technology businesses with nonlinear sort of growth patterns. Now, the one part of this problem is that in a lot of large developing countries, the governments do not let pension funds, for instance, invest in venture capital. So if you look at again the Indian context, there's $100 billion sitting in pension funds, and most of that money is basically parked in treasuries to fund government extravagance. Now, even if you had 2 to 3% of that money that actually went into long-term sort of venture capital-ish money, what you'd basically have is an Indian investor would see low-income or bottom of the pyramid opportunities as the natural thing to do. Because that's where the market is. It's very obvious if you're in these countries that that's where the market is. The market is not in creating the next travel portal. But it requires that money to be unlocked by a government policy and a set of other things that need to happen. So one can always think of this new brand of impact investing capital, etc., as a bridge while governments can actually sort this mess out in terms of where, for instance, pension funds and so on can invest. So again, if I were an entrepreneur and I was looking at opportunities, where would I look? And this sort of ties into my current work, which is around urbanization. And what I would basically say is a mental model of, so I don't know how familiar all of you are with urbanization, but this is probably the biggest secular sort of macro trend in developing countries that's happening today. We've basically gone from a species that, in 1800, 3% of the world lived in urban areas. Today, over 50% does. The projection is 80% of the world will live in urban areas in about 2050. So about 600 cities basically create about 60% of global output today. So urban is a big macro theme, especially in China, Africa, and India. And if you had to bet, this is where you should actually bet. So one could basically think of it as physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and enabling infrastructure. And I would argue that governance, policy, and planning, those are the sort of rules that need to be in place. And this is what the government really needs to do to unlock the rest. And if you basically have the rules in place, if you look at these three sort of areas, broadly speaking, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and enabling infrastructure, I would argue that each of these verticals in India alone is between $100 billion and a $1 trillion opportunity in the next 15 to 20 years. So if you simply open up housing as an opportunity, that housing market, the affordable housing market alone is between $250 and $300 billion, which is a humongous opportunity for entrepreneurs to go, to create wealth, to create businesses, to create jobs, and all of those things, all of those good things. So again, as I said, if I was an entrepreneur, this is where I would look. So before I end, I just want to take a slight deviation into something because I haven't said anything to truly piss off people. So let me sort of say that now, which is everything that I've said right now, including the political entrepreneur bit, there's immense complexity in all of this. I mean, you have no proper theory on where political leaders come from. You have no idea where these shifts take place. You have none of, I mean, this is fiendishly complex. We have no idea, and there's a lot of serendipity involved, et cetera, et cetera. So given all of that, why is it that we have so many magic bullets that show up? So every decade, you have a magic bullet that shows up to cure the world of poverty. So in the 90s, it was the digital divide. All you needed to do was invest a ton of money in computers and poverty would go away. Then it became microfinance, you know, and today there's another variant of it, which is social enterprise. And I mean, most of these things have a function as a stopgap solution, but that's not what it's sold as. It's sold as something that's a miracle cure. Now the problem with that is it's at multiple levels. I mean, I understand why it's sold that way because donor attention demands that you make it sound bigger than it actually is, because that's how donors will put their money down. But there's actually very sad consequences of this. So for instance, the number of perfectly good charities who come to me looking for a business model because donor priorities have shifted. We want to have a sustainable business model. And my response to that quite simply is you're trying to eradicate polio. There is no sustainable business model there. It's a charitable enterprise. And there's nothing wrong with being so. So taking the attention away is one of the sad things about these magic bullets. Now, interestingly enough, here as well, you can ask the question of why magic bullets? And you know, we can discuss this in Q&A if need be, but the paper that I would recommend, which has just come out, there's a paper called A Theory of Good Intention, which is actually truly worth reading in this particular context. Related to this is the issue of misdiagnosing problems. So, I mean, if I had a penny for every time I saw poverty in India juxtaposed with a picture of a slum in Bombay, I'd become a millionaire by now. Now the question is, nobody's actually asking, is a slum in Bombay really poor? Or is the problem something else? So if you just went into a slum in Bombay, you'd basically see, for instance, an informal count would show you that over 50% of the houses have direct-to-home satellite television. That's probably a higher number than Manhattan, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm actually trivializing this a little bit, but ultimately, if you look at the numbers, the economy of Dharavi, which is the largest slum in Bombay, is over $1 billion. Okay, there's real strivers in there. So the question is, what the hell is going on? And that's entirely correlated with real estate prices. So we did the analysis of the numbers, and we simply said, if I were to provide a slum dweller a house of 300 square feet, which is the sort of standard definition of what an affordable house should look like, 300 square feet or 30 square meters. Once you include the cost of land, each of these houses, 300 square feet of rehabilitation, would cost you $80,000 to $85,000 once you include the cost of land, in a country that has a per capita income of $1,500. So now ask yourself the question, is a slum a sign of poverty, or is it a sign of bad real estate policy? I mean, what is it? And the reason why people make this mistake of thinking, immediately correlating a slum with poverty, is because they haven't. So if you're a visitor to India, what you're more likely to see is a slum in Bombay. You're very unlikely to see the village in Bihar, which these people have actually migrated out of. And trust me, that looks a lot worse. So, having said all of this, let me just end with a broad set of conclusions. And we've sort of walked this through. So what are my conclusions? I mean, institutions matter, right? I mean, so, I actually didn't address this issue, which was when I was talking about the outlier political leaders. By and large, I think what you can reasonably say is that institutions matter for countries to develop. Now, the problem is you actually know what rules work. So you know what rules worked in Taiwan, you know what rules work in South Korea, and yet it is so hard to implement those rules elsewhere. So why is it that some rules are easier to transmit than other rules? So for instance, the rules around vaccination are very easy to transmit. Life expectancy by and large across the world has gone up. But the rules around institutions, for instance, are very, very hard to actually put in place. And nobody's been able to figure out why that is. I mean, obviously there's political economy explanations for this. So therefore, institutions matter, but political leadership matters even more. Again, as I said, I mean, entrepreneurship, we need to have a much better developed idea of how, when, where, or why entrepreneurs show up from, and how we can actually create a culture that actually encourages entrepreneurship. The right type of entrepreneur, as I said, don't celebrate survival entrepreneurship. That should actually be eliminated. Because of the market clearance issues that I talked about, I think there is a role for catalytic capital. And that can be provided by philanthropy, that can be provided by government, that can be provided by aid, that can be provided by a whole range of actors. But here again, the caveat to this is philanthropists should not start by assuming that their money can solve these humongous problems like poverty, for instance. Because as far as I can tell from the data, only economic growth can actually end poverty, not philanthropic dollars. So the question to ask is, what could philanthropic dollars do? And I would argue that it should perform the catalytic function. And the catalysis can be financial, it can be strategic, it can be political. It can be a whole range of functions that catalytic capital can function. Encourage trial and error and ensure that incentives are actually economy-wide rather than sector or firm specific. Because that's one of these things that you always see, is that when you have sector-specific incentives being put in place, that actually distorts the market and basically pushes entrepreneurs and pushes resources into areas that may or may not be the most optimal place for it to be in. So any incentives that you set up should be economy-wide rather than firm or sector-specific. Demonstration matters. As I said, I mean, one of the key things that we've noticed is once you demonstrate that a market exists, other players pile in. And that's something that we've consistently noticed, is once you open up the market, a lot of other players will come in. Avoid frame of reference biases, which is what I said. I mean, if you're flying in from London or New York, a slum in Bombay may look dreadfully poor, but that is because of your own frame of reference bias. You should actually go beyond that to ask, what is actually going on there? And you may arrive at a different conclusion, and you may actually spot opportunities that you would not otherwise. As I said, no magic bullets. And finally, just a word on technology, which is the other thing that people tend to fetishize. Always think of technology as a means to an end. Technology by itself cannot solve problems. It is actually a means to an end, and treat it as such. And as I said, above all, the consequences of failure need to be minimized. Robert Kennedy had this great line in which he says, only those who dare to fail greatly will ever achieve greatly. And I'll stop with that.
Reuben, thank you. A wonderful introduction to the paper and the ideas. We appreciate that. That gets us started. Gunilla, maybe I could turn to you first, and feel free to respond to anything that Reuben has said. But also, you said to me before we started this afternoon, after I think 7 years as a Minister of International Development in your country, a tenure that ended in mid-September, not so long ago, that for the first time in years you have time to think. And I'd be interested in knowing what you're thinking about what you've done for a half a decade or so.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And thank you, Reuben, because I think what I've been thinking about it is what drives development. Because when you're doing aid, you try to solve something in a short period of time. And I think development takes time, and it's also very complex. And that's why I think we sometimes think that if we just have some inputs, we could come out with some good results that mean ending poverty. And I think we are making it too complicated and too easy, if you see what I mean. Because we have to ask ourselves, what drives development and what are the obstacles? And I think a lot of things that are linked to poverty is actually market failure or lack of markets. Because we see how poor people today really strive and many times have some money to pay for, but they pay the most for the worst services, as the market do have failures. And that is something I think we have to analyze more, instead of just having a lot of inputs into trying to solve a problem that probably could be helped out now with these trends that are, of course, urbanization, but also so the digitalization, the access of knowledge, and understanding about that you need this enabling infrastructure with governance, with public policy, and also the opportunity for planning. And that is actually the same in a mature economy like Sweden. We have to every day as ministers look to these different mental models to see, are there things that we can do better in order to not only spur development but also growth, and to see that that is sustainable. Mm-hmm. So I think it's also, we are making it too complex when it should be a little bit easier.
Do we overestimate at our times our ability to do harm or good?
I think but that's more from now a donor's perspective. Mm-hmm. As we are working we are trying to align aid, and we are trying to really harmonize how we are doing things. But we are too many actors running to different things without seeing the broader picture, and trying just to fix a few things and not to see the broader picture. You see what I mean? So that's why I think the aid industry is in one way perhaps being good at seeing poor people, but perhaps not providing the right tools mm-hmm. for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Reuben, before I get Guy into the conversation, could you say a little bit about culture, broadly speaking? You conclude the paper with 11 lessons learned, and you start with institutions, and then you get at the end to technology. But say a little bit about, speaking of complexity, the opportunity, but also the burden of culture, and that could be history, it could be religion, it could be ethnicity and sectarianism, it could be national narratives of victimization and grievance, but certainly culture. It's not an engineering problem. It's not a problem that lends itself, as you put in the paper, to magic bullets or formulas. Say a little bit about the role of culture broadly defined in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely think, so there's two parts to the culture piece, which is, one is if you look at the very long historical argument, which is, why is it that some cultures are just so much better at this than other cultures? And I haven't found any convincing, so for instance, the Phoenicians/Lebanese, why were they such great traders for the last 3,000 years? I don't know. So similarly, there are communities in India. Primarily, there's three communities: the Gujaratis, the Marwadis, and the Sindhis, who are probably amongst the best entrepreneurs in the world. Why? I don't know. But you can consistently run into these very long-run historical, the Persians. So, if you look at sort of the trade routes, you'll find that a lot of the Persians were sailors. They actually mastered the trade winds. The Arabs had mastered the trade winds. So what is the cultural factor? I mean, the long-term cultural factors, I have absolutely no idea why these evolve the way they do. The more short-term ones are easier to identify. So if you look at, for instance, California as the best example of this. I mean, you can totally see why California became what it is, because California attracted crazy people. I mean, for the last 150 years, California has attracted crazy people. From the people who went looking for gold, to the hippies, to you name it. It's always been a home for crazy people. So experimentation is at the core of California. Israel, as a separate example, which is the response to, I mean, my guess is that because of the extreme volatility of what is going on and the role played by the IDF, by the Israeli Defense Forces in the venture capital industry and so on. So I think in each of these you will find, and then the involvements of the diaspora, so the Chinese diaspora, the Indian diaspora, there's a lot of that happening. But I think if you make the long-term trend, I have absolutely no idea why certain things turn out the way they do. The short-term trend, I think almost definitely correlates to the concept of risk and failure. As in, there are people who just take failure a lot better than other people. And that is where you will typically find a lot of entrepreneurship occurring.
Thank you. Guy, let's get you in. You are free and invited to comment on anything you've heard, but if I may also ask, bring us home a little bit, because you're working in the UK, this think tank is in the UK. We've been talking about international development and entrepreneurship, and if you would, bring us into the UK context a little bit.
Okay, well the first thing I'd say, I think, is that all of the problems you've highlighted apply in developed markets as well as undeveloped markets. It's simply a question of degree, and I think that's an interesting feature. I think in the UK, just to bring it home, we are experiencing what I would call an entrepreneur revolution at the moment, particularly in the major cities, the urban areas, where effectively, I think it's an uprising actually, and here we are sitting with the Centre for Entrepreneurs, which is one of a number of think tank groups that has sprung up. And what we've seen happen through a perfect blend of circumstances, I believe, over the last 5 years or so, since we've had recession, unemployment, evolution of technology, greater globalization, unemployment, fear, and indeed generational change, because we've got a lot of the younger generation, so-called the Facebook generation, coming into the workforce now. We're actually seeing an environment where entrepreneurship is coming to the fore. People don't want to work for other people, they want to work for themselves. And I think that's a cultural thing, going back to what we were talking about before. And I think it's a healthy cultural thing, because, I'm not quite sure about the survivor entrepreneur and whether or not it's a bad idea to encourage survivor entrepreneurship. I think en masse, survivor entrepreneurship is obviously a problem because it creates millions of sole traders. But ultimately, some of those will rise out. And I think there are a lot of initiatives happening in the UK. You've probably seen Startup Britain, startup loans, all sorts of foundations and organisations that are giving small amounts, microfinance to early stage entrepreneurs to try to help them get off the ground. Many of those are not going to be successful. We know that when we start. But I think someone once said to me, if you've got nothing to do, go and polish the church pews because something will happen. And I think that's, that's just something I believe. You need to actually get out there and do something. And I think that may be aligned to your survivor entrepreneur.
I mean, the only thing that I would mention is survival entrepreneurship that I was referring to is exclusively a developing country problem, where because enough opportunities aren't being created in the formal sector, people are forced to go do this sort of thing. So, I mean, Britain and developing countries.
I understand.
But the interesting point that you're making, which I think is specifically what London and New York have been doing over the last 10 years to become a hotbed of sort of entrepreneurship. And so in that sense, it's actually policy driven. I mean, it's the mayors basically taking a position that we need a lot more of this. So if you look at New York, I mean, all the way from Technion and Cornell setting up the research campus, and it's very policy driven. So it's to me, it's fascinating to see what will come of this. I mean, and so if you look at the US, for instance, I mean, New York is already the second largest source of entrepreneurs after California. I mean, it's overtaken Boston recently. So it's fascinating to see policy-driven entrepreneurial climate as well.
Which we are seeing very much in the UK. I mean, 5 years ago, entrepreneurship, the word, was almost a bit of a fringe word.
Right.
Now it's absolutely at the centre of the agenda. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's trying to encourage it. Everyone realises that governments spend money and entrepreneurs create it. And so the whole shift has taken place to try to find ways of getting people on that ladder of entrepreneurship.
But can I ask, is it mainly driven by politics or by people?
I think it's driven by a whole set of factors. The politicians encourage it, sometimes effectively, sometimes not so effectively. The people are, I think the social media effect is absolutely enormous. People are influenced by what they see in the media. I think that's true across the world now. You know, we all have access to the internet and pretty much open. We can find out almost anything we want to find out at any time, and we can see how other people are living. Twitter is an instant news feed. All of this stuff has a huge impact on the ability of people to understand what's going on around them, and they can then decide whether or not they want to take part. I think the big problem we have is that there's a chasm between the haves and the have-nots, even in this country, and that the have-nots don't actually know how to become haves.
Sure.
It's the unknown unknown. They simply have no way of trying to figure out how they get from over here to over here. They're just as capable as the people over here, but because they've been brought up in an environment which has been an environment of hardship, that's what they think they're born into, and they need to be somehow given the bridge out of that environment into a new life. I think that's the biggest challenge for us in the UK.
And that is access to education, access to capital, and also breaking the barriers to have this culture shift.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, going back about 30 years, I was immensely impressed when I became an accountant, and one of the guys I trained with had seen an advert. His father was unemployed. He came from a very poor family. There were lots of children living in his house, and he just saw this thing one day. He said, "I'm going to go and do that," and he lifted himself out. Now, there aren't many people. I've always admired that. There aren't many people who can do that, and I think we need to try and find a way of helping more people understand their opportunity. There's a guy actually, just to mention, called Herman Stewart, who believes that every child should have a mentor. And his campaign is to get every child a mentor by 2017, I think. Now, obviously, that's not a one-to-one, but basically that tries to deal with the haves and the have-nots. How can we actually get people from one camp into the other?
Gunilla, could you say something about the debate in Sweden and Scandinavia? Has there been a shift in the last half dozen years from entrepreneur and entrepreneurship being a fringe idea to now more mainstream? Is it similar to what Guy described in Britain?
Yes, definitely. And also, I mean, I'm a little bit biased here because I'm coming from the government, but we have tried to invest a lot in research development and also trying to do more on innovations. And we see now that we are more courageous. There are more young people, there are more startups, and there is still, of course, a lot of things we have to look to, like the cost of doing business and so on and so forth. There are a lot of barriers at the same thing that others are facing. But I can definitely see now a shift with more of confidence in yourself and thereby taking the risks. But also that Sweden has a rather sound macroeconomic situation. That means also that people are more perhaps willing to take the risks. So it is so complex. But we are striving to try to do this. But also I think the amount of people at the same place with different kinds of, I mean, also we have some kind of diversity in our country today from different cultures, and I think that's also helpful. And we have enough people in these thriving cities, because actually urbanization is, I think Sweden is one of the countries that are urbanized fastest than anyone for the moment. And we are also developing countries in one way, because I think every country are developing, or should be at least.
I mean,
but of course from different levels. But I think basically it's the same. And what we have to look to is to see how can we see that we are leaving no one behind, and how can we let people have access
I agree.
to fulfilling their own lives. And those barriers should be tackled, I think, both from an individual point of view, but also from, can I say, a state level's point of view.
So I mean, my question to you, Gunilla, is from the ministry standpoint, was there, in the activities that you had outside in developing countries, was there a move towards encouraging entrepreneurship as part of Swedish giving? I mean, Sweden gives a lot of money.
Yes, but it was more trying to understand the environment, because I think we have to see that official develop assistance has to be invested in those that do really not have anything. I think it's good that we at the same time see, when we are investing in help for poor people, we should see that why do we have to do that? Is it a market failure or a policy failure? And many times it is a problem of not functioning institutions. And that's why the capacity building and understanding about good governance are crucial here for countries to have their own destiny and their own choices, to see how they can leave no one behind, and we could then assist. But the problem is that I think development assistance would never be the triggering point for more of entrepreneurship.
Sure.
That is at least what I think.
Reuben, could you say a little bit more about that question of institutions? It was number one on your list by accident or order of importance. What are those institutions that promote these good things and whose absence obviously are an impediment?
I mean, you can start with rule of law and security. I mean, even when we do our work on cities, for instance, I mean, it's fascinating to me that in any cities conversation, you never hear the word rule of law. And that's, I think this is I think this is what's going on. I think anybody who's sort of lived in the West takes it for granted. Whereas rule of law is a huge problem in a lot of other places. So absent the rule of law, I mean, so this great book that I've been reading over the last week was a book called The Siege, which is a fantastic account of the terror attacks on Bombay. And what you see out there is this colossal failure of the rule of law, of the complete, utter breakdown of the rule of law mechanism. So I would start with rule of law and security, and then beyond that, contracts, bankruptcy laws. And by the way, I think things like bankruptcy laws also affect the culture, as in the failure bit is actually influenced by those sort of things. Bankruptcy laws, ensuring that contracts are respected.
So clean and independent courts.
Clean and independent courts. So property rights, transparency in governance, lack of corruption. By the way, these are all I'm just throwing these things out, but they are so interrelated with so many other things. So it's very easy to say corruption, when in fact corruption is fed by two things. One is over-regulation, which is because the more touch points you have with the government, the more you're likely to encounter corruption. But the other piece, which nobody actually talks about, and it's the gorilla in the room, which is that it's directly correlated with campaign finance in all of these countries. Because at the end of the day, what are you selling spectrum on the fly for? You're selling spectrum because you need to fund the elections. And the government piece of the election finance is actually so ridiculously low that politicians have to go raise money from elsewhere. And that's the source of corruption. So each of these has, complex, there's a lot of complexity in it, but if I had to just throw a bunch of things out, I mean, and maybe Guy, you want to throw,
but I think you probably labelled most of them,
yeah.
haven't you? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, absent institutions, I just don't see how it plays out without institutions.
All right, let's leave that for the podium, for the panel right now there, and then let's open it up to the audience. And there's a microphone somewhere, Jordan, thank you very much, that will come to you, which you need to take, identify yourself, and ask your question. This gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Ben Dellett. I work as a researcher at the RSA. Reuben, you mentioned the role of mayors, and I wondered what your thoughts were on the capacity of nation states to promote and encourage entrepreneurship. So if you look at the US, you've had Bloomberg, who's had a huge impact on New York. And if you look at the UK, if you take, for instance, changes to the education system, which means that schools have more freedom to do what they want to do, and the government has less say on what they deliver in terms of enterprise education, for instance. All of these things give us a sense that perhaps we have the wrong focus, that maybe our focus should lay less on the nation state and more on cities.
Yeah. No, so, I mean, I'm kite flying now, but I think you're absolutely right. Because again, if you just break down GDP globally, you'll see the contributions of cities are just so dramatic in all of these that I think a lot of problems that we're trying to address at the nation state level should actually be addressed at the city level, and we could actually find very quick solutions. Now, the C40 initiative, which is Bloomberg's big initiative on climate, which is simply 40 of the mayors of some of the biggest urban regions in the world coming together and basically saying, we can do something about it. Let's not get bogged down in national level negotiations. Now, the problem, of course, is for that to work, you actually need power to basically be decentralized down to the level of the mayor. Now, what happens in most developing countries is that there is more and more centralization. So if you look at, for instance, what's happening in Sri Lanka right now, the government, it was actually a fairly decentralized system of government, but the brothers are just basically taking all of the power into themselves. So if you want effective subnational governance, there also needs to be, those guys who are running those governments need to have power. I mean, if you went to Bombay today and asked, and I work on cities, by the way, and if you ask me who's the mayor of Bombay, I have no idea. And neither will anybody else. And there is a mayor of Bombay. It's not like there isn't. It's just that he's so totally neutered by the state government and the national government. So you're right in terms of, I think subnational governance is important, but to enable that, you actually need to basically bring power down and decentralize power.
All the way in the back, Matt Smith. Matt, tell us who you are.
So, Matt Smith, the director of the Centre for Entrepreneurs. To build on that question from Ben, and this is probably one more for Guy, we've seen London expanding as an entrepreneurship hub, attracting people from across the world, across Europe. And our chairman was on Bloomberg last week making the suggestion that we'd see 5% growth next year in London, but perhaps not outside the M25. How well do you think the UK is doing, and other cities across the UK, to boost entrepreneurship, to match the success of London?
The other cities are not moving at the same rate as London, there's no doubt about that. Cities like Birmingham and Manchester are definitely showing strong signs of life, as is Bristol. There are various, you have, I mean, London is the hub in the UK, there's no doubt about that. This is where it all begins, but it's very important because we can influence what's happening in the rest of the economy. People will see what's happening in London and the south, if you like, and hopefully that will give encouragement to people to start doing the same sorts of things in other areas. So in London we see a technology cluster, for example, that we call Tech City, and that's actually attracted huge amounts of attention, and I think 16,000 new companies in the year or something have been created in Tech City. In Bristol we see a media city emerging. There are nanotechnology clusters starting up in places like Cambridge. So I think that this is going back to your point of sub-national or localized impact. And I think that is really the way it starts, because people locally can do something about it and make something happen. If you try and do it at too high a level, then probably you'll find that you're being muted, or whatever the word was. It's very difficult to do anything.
Guy, if you're looking at another city in the UK that's struggling, and this is back at the envelope, very basics, and you're advising policymakers or government of a short list of things to do and a short list of things to not do, what's your list?
Wow. That's a challenging question. So we need to create an ecosystem in a city. Somehow we need to find the successful entrepreneurial companies and individuals, and we need to hold them up and get them involved in the community to start to inspire other people, smaller businesses, start-up businesses, etc. You need to find some way of providing education and finance within that community as an enabler. In the UK, actually, we have something called Startup Loans, which is doing that at the moment. What should you not do? you can't force the issue, you can't control things. So what we really want is we want light touch points, we want enabling politics, and then we want the community to take over and actually make things happen. So it's difficult to describe, but basically the command and control type of economy isn't going to work. And I think that people here all over the UK now are enlightened about that, and they realise they've got to go out and do it themselves. So I think what we need to do is create an environment where people want to go out and do things themselves. We need to inspire them to do that. And quite what all the policies are in each city to do that, I have to say I haven't given any thought
So
to.
it's modeling, it's mentoring, it's access to capital, and it's environment, but you can't command them and dictate.
You can't. They have to want to do it. So you have to inspire them.
Yeah.
It's got to be organic. I mean, there's got to be incentives in the system that politicians can respond to.
This gentleman back here, and then Mark Stolzen. But this gentleman first. And tell us who you are, please.
Hi, I'm Niklesh. I'm doing my PhD at UCL, and I used to work with Reuben at one point, so I'm familiar with some of his work. And I concur completely on your point about survival entrepreneurship and the link between microfinance and micro-entrepreneurship being fairly tenuous. But one of the problems of the sort of, obviously that's a very small study of the ISP students who come out, and you've got less than 1% building successful businesses. So the question then is, if entrepreneurship is kind of linked to culture, institutions, but if you had to pick one to put your money into, which would that be?
Oh, institutions for sure, because I think institutions can affect culture. So without a shadow of doubt, it'd be institutions. I mean, the bigger problem is the other point that I was raising about the political piece of this, which is, yes, you know these rules work. And you also know if you're in a developing country, fundamentally you realize the fact that you're caught in a bad set of rules. The question is, how do you move from a bad set of rules to a good set of rules? And that's the ultimate political economy question. Now the problem is, some people are able to make that jump. Deng Xiaoping did it. Lee Kuan Yew did it. But yet, there's an entire bunch of other politicians or political leaders who can't seem to make that jump. And it's not like you need to overturn rules. There are all sorts of fixes that you can go for. So if you think about what Deng Xiaoping did, which is basically the investments into the special economic regions, I mean, it was a very creative way around the system. And he didn't try to do it in Beijing and Shanghai. He went to a little sleepy fishing village near Hong Kong called Shenzhen, and that's where he tried it, changed the rules. Nobody noticed before it was too late in many ways. And today it's a $100 billion economy. Just Shenzhen alone is a $100 billion economy. And per capita there has jumped from $500 in 1981 to $10,000 today.
Mark.
Mark Stolzen with the Legatum Group. Reuben, two quick questions, if you'll indulge me. Quick questions, long answers probably. These are complicated. One is, in your research, did you explore the relationship or correlation between tax policy and a healthy sort of ecosystem for entrepreneurship?
Sure.
If so, would love to hear about that. Second is, are access to healthcare and education preconditions for growth, or is growth a precondition to access to healthcare and education? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, to the first, I haven't investigated it in any great detail, but keep in mind the fact that the two hubs of entrepreneurship in the US, California, the Bay Area, and New York, are two of the highest tax places in the country. So I don't necessarily know if taxes are the right set of incentives there. So, I mean, in fact, I've been sort of, with policymakers in India, I've been pushing this idea that what you really need is not special economic zones, because the special economic zones almost always implies tax breaks. But what you actually need is special governance zones, where different rules apply. Whereas special economic zones they start from the notion of tax breaks, and by and large haven't been successful. Your second question was?
Preconditions for growth?
So my personal bias is, I think, growth, because, so again, as I said, if you just look at the data, you see no correlation, other than basically telling you that you need about 50% literacy to take off. I don't think that's particularly useful. What you definitely see is, to keep sustained growth, you actually then need to invest heavily in human capability. But is health and education the precondition for growth? I don't think so. I actually think it goes the other way.
So could that be a distinction between developing and developed countries, where, including in Europe and the United States, you have an emerging split where one group is racing fast ahead, and a precondition for those others to catch up is access to education and better health?
It's a good question, Jeff. I haven't thought about it, but in the US context, I can certainly tell you that the massive inequality that you're seeing, which is basically driven by productivity gains driven by technology, I think that is entirely an education issue, because I think the supply is just not keeping up with demand. So it's not like if you look at median wages, they're stagnating, but average wages are going up, which means that people at the top are making off like bandits. So the education piece in the US is very clear to me. And if you don't invest in education very heavily, and as productivity goes up, move them and retrain them and reskill them, I think that's a horrible battle if you don't invest in education. The rest of it, no, I haven't thought about it, Jeff.
Okay. Yes, sir.
John Egan, CEO of Sandbox. Question for Reuben. Especially over the last 5 years, the word entrepreneur and all of its derivatives have almost become jaded times to the point of being meaningless. You distinguish between 3 different types of entrepreneurship, but I would be curious to hear what your definition of entrepreneurship is.
I would basically, so what I would always tell my students is an entrepreneur is somebody who looks at inefficiency and sees opportunity.
So push back on that slightly then. I think that's just a change in definition, but I think globally that's very, very similar to the expressions that we get, especially from an awful lot of academic institutions about what entrepreneurship is now. Do you think that maybe positions entrepreneurship as a destination, that we should be trying to facilitate an environment where we have more entrepreneurs, instead of acknowledging the fact that nobody starts a business to start a business. People start businesses to accomplish something. So regardless of what level of the pyramid you're at, if it's a survival entrepreneur starting a business to survive, or if it's Mark Zuckerberg starting a business to prove a point or to express themselves, it changes fundamentally the way you actually approach encouraging entrepreneurship, if it's no longer a destination, but in fact a mechanism to accomplish something.
I mean, which is why I made the point about trial and error.
Yeah.
I mean, what you need is just massive experimentation. And any sort of environment that sort of enables that sort of trial and error is basically what I'm pushing for. Survival entrepreneurship, on the other hand, is a completely different beast. I mean, I don't think that's trial and error.
Yeah, I'm Irish, I've seen both sides of it. So.
But I think here is what we have to look a little bit to also, I think, with combating poverty. I mean, you have a problem to solve. And how do you solve it? And if you are not allowed to work together on solving the problem, because there is a lot of demands, and the growth potential in many low-income countries is enormous. But the problem is, how can you get organized to solve the problem? And then if there are obstacles to entrepreneurship, you will lose out the opportunity. So there is a lot of hidden opportunities due to the lack of entrepreneurship, due to what you have elaborated upon here today, Reuben. I think that's one way of looking into it.
I can give you a very specific example from India, which is the labor laws of India. So if you look at the economy, you've got agriculture, which is about 13% of GDP, employs about 50% of the workforce, which is a huge problem. I mean, there's a huge productivity problem right there. Now, in a classical sort of sense, what would happen is as agricultural productivity goes up, you'd basically move into manufacturing and industry and then on to services. Now, the problem is the manufacturing sector is entirely hobbled by really, really bad labor laws. So therefore, no entrepreneur has any incentive to start anything in manufacturing. And so if he starts anything in manufacturing, you can best your last dollar that he's doing something that's capital intensive, not labor intensive. Now, that's a clear structural problem that is created by bad policy. And by the way, this is yet another very interesting story of, I mean, a friend of mine who works on the Prime Minister's Skills Council, he says this explicitly. He says, the problem here is how do you change the rules when everybody agrees with you? I mean, there's no dispute about the labor laws. Everybody knows it's messed up. But somebody somewhere can't basically summon the political capital to do something about it.
Guy, could you take a stab at that same question, starting with the definition of entrepreneur? Because I'd like to hear what your definition is, and I don't know where you were going with it, but it does seem to me, interestingly, that as this term, idea, concept has gone from fringe to, hit or hot, that it does get, in some instances, drained of meaning, because these days, who's not an entrepreneur? Bankers are entrepreneurs. Corporate CEOs are entrepreneurs. Bank managers are CEOs. And that's all business, and that's all enterprise, and it's all good insofar as it goes, but an entrepreneur must be something different, right?
Well, I think there is a difference, actually, between an entrepreneur and an intrapreneur. And I think when you talk about bankers and people like that, they tend to be intrapreneurs. They're joining a post-entrepreneurial business, right? It's an established business. They're going into typically a management role. They may have to be creative and innovate, which is the entrepreneurial element of their role, but nevertheless they're employees and they're rewarded for being employees, and they are entrepreneurs. And the key factor, I think, is that they're not taking an economic risk. So for me, an entrepreneur is someone that takes an economic risk, knowingly, willingly, and is prepared effectively to fail. So I think that's it. And I think the other point is, if they can see disruption in an opportunity to disrupt a market or whatever, that's a true entrepreneur. Then you're getting into the Steve Jobs and all the rest of it. Many entrepreneurs simply look at a business model and think, I can do that better, and they just go off and start a business and
improve themselves.
Yeah, actually, it is very interesting. The one point I would make about the age that people become entrepreneurs. Lots of people become entrepreneurs straight out of school. Well, not lots, but some. And many of the famous names never went through university. They just started businesses. Richard Branson, for example, just started a business. And if they don't go straight into it, then often they do go through some sort of cycle of university employment, and this is in the UK, obviously, until such time as they've learnt their trade, and then they've figured out how to do it better than the people that employ them. And then they become entrepreneurs. And there are therefore a lot of later stage entrepreneurs in the UK who have been through some kind of training and perhaps accumulated a little bit of security and wealth in order to enable them to do it.
I've always been fond, this is at its root, I think, it seems to me, that first comes the idea. There's an idea. It's a highly creative activity. And I've always been fond of the definition that holds that the entrepreneur is the individual who creates ideas for which capital has not yet been allocated. And then all those other things are important too: access to capital, risk, implementation. Let's take a couple more, and then we'll go to reception. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Graham Henderson from Poet in the City. Quite rightly, this discussion has been emphasising the wealth-generating aspects of entrepreneurship. But I'm very interested in, as the last few questions and points have indicated, the entrepreneur type. And there are also people out there who are social entrepreneurs or cultural entrepreneurs. So I'm interested to hear what the panel thinks about this type of person who is actually shifting public perceptions, shifting public tastes, creating new markets, and also changing tastes and attitudes. Because your Hoxton digital entrepreneur may be making money and they may be creating jobs, but they're also, are they not changing society?
Well, Graham, can I throw it, before the panel takes it, because you're exactly the right person to pose that, let's throw it back to you for a second. Think of a city like London. You said social entrepreneurs, you said cultural entrepreneurs. I don't know if there's a distinction, but I've come across this collocation, creative entrepreneurs. And what would this city's economy be like without entrepreneurs in fashion, theater, music, the culinary aspect? Would you say a little bit about that? And then we'll give it to the panel.
Sure. I mean, it just strikes me that actually the skills we associate with entrepreneurs are being deployed in all of these different industries. And wealth generation is not always or often the primary motivation. Primary motivation is to make something happen and do something new. And that, I think a lot of the same skills which we identify in our Richard Bransons are also being used, as you suggest, by people who are trying to create new markets for the arts, trying to create tastes in something which are currently unfashionable, but which they're trying to make fashionable So very much the same skills. So it sort of raises the question of the entrepreneur as an agent of social change.
Okay. Thank you. Who would like to begin with that?
I think this raises the whole issue of corporate social responsibility as much as anything else. I mean, I think social entrepreneurship in its truest form is an absolutely wonderful thing. I mean, I act for a company, I'm not sure I can mention the name, but they're a membership organisation, they are for profit, but they actually go around, their members go around singing in lots of different places. And as a result of their activities, they make an enormous amount of money for charity. So effectively, they are a sustainable business that goes out and effectively raises money for charity. Now, I regard that as a social business. I don't know whether it's I'm not sure how it was started and what the driver was, you know, but sometimes these things just happen. But I think corporate social responsibility is on the move, and I think that organisations, generally speaking, need to have some sort of higher purpose these days. They need to understand why they exist, whether they damage the planet, whether they have a triple bottom line, as they call it, people, planet and profit, and whether they pay attention to that. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but so I think it's important that organisations have that higher purpose, or they need to think about it. Why do they exist? Sorry.
So I don't have much to say about cultural entrepreneurs, though I think it's hugely important. I just haven't thought about it enough. The social entrepreneur bit, I mean, one way to think about it is, is there any kind of entrepreneur who's not social? I mean, what is the opposite of social entrepreneur? Anti-social entrepreneur? I mean, what does that even mean? So,
very good.
So I'm not, so this notion of creating this subclass of entrepreneurs who create more social good than the other class of entrepreneurs is something that I personally find, quite distasteful. But then related to all the problems that I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that, you've got perfectly good charities that are being driven out of business by this fad for social entrepreneurship. Donor priorities, all of these things. I mean, the number of them who come to you saying, find me a sustainable business model. Why? I mean, why can't you just do what you're doing? I mean, if you're in the business of, I don't know, as I said, polio vaccines, there is no sustainable business model there. So I think this is a dangerous trend because it's to my mind, it's a diversion and I just don't see why you can't just let it be entrepreneurship. Yeah, I know I've pissed off somebody in the audience.
What we're going to do, we're going to take one more, then we're going to wrap up, and then we're going to invite you to
There's a question
we're going to
there
take
as
two
well.
more, and then we'll wrap up and invite you to reception. We'll take this person Jordan, right to your, she's been waiting first, and then this gentleman in the...
Yeah, go ahead.
Switch order.
I'd probably take it. I'd probably take as exception because I'm doing a master's in social entrepreneurship. But I do disagree with you on this point because the social, I mean, it is a new trend, and underlying it is this change in actual attitudes of the purpose of actually what an organisation stands for. And fair enough, maybe the business models mightn't be kind of circumspect, but the trend, I don't think it's actually a fad because underneath it all, there's actually, it's going to change the dynamics of how we look at corporations and what they're there for and how they relate to society, rather than just being a massive corporation that's got a gazillion balance sheet, but what's that doing for society?
But isn't that, I mean, with social entrepreneurship or not, but isn't that also how the society are organized in a different way? Because it's also about solving problems. So you organize entrepreneurially to solve a problem, whether it's social or cultural or whatever. Before you perhaps did it, but within the family or within the village. But now you can go at scale, now you can find your scope, you can also make these global. So of course there is a changing trend, but I think entrepreneurship is about also solving problems, figuring out what to do, what's missing here. And that's why you could do it, whether it's for economic reasons and to fulfill your own wishes to become better than Steve Jobs, or to just do it because you see that there is a need and I can organize and me and others around to solve that problem, and to use market incentives to do that, and to have entrepreneurial skills to make others to rally around it and to go at scale. So it's different from what it was before, but I think more and more things are going now to markets in one way, in the way we are living in this society.
I mean, my favorite example of this is if I ask this room if people have heard of microfinance, every hand will go up. If I ask the same room, have you heard of chit funds? How many hands go up? One. So the chit fund industry has been around for over 100 years. The amount of capital in circulation in chit funds in India alone is 150 billion US dollars. The microfinance industry is between 5 and 10 billion dollars. Yet, because there's a sexy story wrapped around one, it gets noticed. The chit fund industry is just sitting there. They're minding their own business. They don't claim to be doing anything social or anything of the sort. But in fact, what they're doing is immensely social. So how do you distinguish between these two? And this is a very real problem. You know, when you wrap something in sexiness, it just gets noticed.
Can I add something to what
Yes.
you said?
Take the microphone.
Different plans to leave India by 2015. And since the last 8 months, there's been a lot of experts trying to give them options about staying in India. And they have managed to agree to stay in India on
It's not
social.
experts, there's another word for it.
Yeah.
But
Social entrepreneurship. And they have finally agreed that 2015 post, they won't have a physical presence in India, but they will invest a lot of money in social entrepreneurship in India. So I agree with what he's saying, that as long as it's an exciting story wrapped around it, given by donors, people agree to it, but there's no fact to it.
Now, finally, please.
Hello, Maxine McIntosh. I'm a neuroscience student at UCL, so nothing particularly related to entrepreneurship per se.
Actually, that's wrong. In fact, I'm actually very
Officially.
curious about what a neuroscientist has to say about entrepreneurs, because there is actually a book that talks about the God gene and so on.
I'm afraid I'm not talking about the genetic or neurological basis behind it, but it was touched on philanthropy being sort of acting catalytically and limitations with aid. So this is quite a sort of well-trodden path. And touching on what you said about cultural reasons, so do you feel that aid is now culturally embedded and therefore stifling entrepreneurship, both from the donor and acceptor point of view?
Do you want to go first?
I think that aid, we have to see also to be clear that aid is actually trying to solve something with intervening and coming from outside to insert a few things in order to solve a profound problem that has many layers of reasons. As Reuben has pointed out, why are people poor? Is it just lack of health? No, it's not. And many people are poor because they don't have a job. And why don't they have a job? Well, there are multiple reasons for that. They are not job creation. So that's why we have to understand that aid has had a history. We're trying to fix very complicated problems in a simple way, and that simply doesn't work. So that's why I think aid has to really to find its own legitimacy and to really try to figure out where can we have an added value and leave the rest for true development and policy reforms. And I think aid is starting to think about that as also those that are the recipients, the aspirational people of the world, are no longer so happy about being receivers. They also want to become actors. So I hope for the future that we need still to invest in human development, whether we're calling it aid or well, whatever, but I think we really have to figuring out where we are having the best target and the best results. And that's why we have to make these analyses so that we are doing no harm.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, you know, my starting point with any discussion on aid is the old medical thing of do no harm. That should be your first principle. And in fact, what a lot of aid does is actually a lot of market distortion, a lot of harm. Now, having said that, going back to what Gunilla said, the key is to basically find the plumbing issues, right? What is it that is actually clogging markets? Or what is it that's preventing the economy from functioning well? and sort of address some of those issues. Now, I'll give you two specific examples of aid actually being very useful. One was, I would argue that the single best thing that USAID did in India, for instance, was actually training capital markets regulators. May not seem like conventional use of aid, but in the way they basically then went on to set up the regulatory system around the markets actually has proved to be extraordinarily useful. And the second example is from our own experience. I'm involved with a large emerging markets fund, and one of the key things that we've been doing is actually setting up first loss guarantees. And so what you mean by that is you go to a poor country, for instance, and you see that the banking system does not lend to SMEs. And that's primarily because you can't price the risk. And so what you're basically saying is, look, we'll set up a first loss guarantee for you. So your first losses will be absorbed by us. And you set up whatever sort of first loss guarantee it is that you set up. But based on that, you actually set up a lot of lending actually happens, because going back to the point about the pricing of risk, because a lot of it is actually the perception of risk rather than the reality of risk. So it's useful to think through where it is that the plumbing problems exist and what can be filled by whether it's aid or philanthropic dollars or whatever you want to call it.
Gunilla, before we wrap up here, I have a question for you because you're the one politician among us. Someone said to me, right or wrong, but I thought it was interesting, someone said to me about the last US presidential election that one important reason why Mitt Romney lost was he did a good job of appealing to entrepreneurs, but not those people who just want to work for entrepreneurs. How this has been a love fest of entrepreneurship here this afternoon, of the cultural and the social and the creative and each and every kind you can think of. What does one do? How does one inspire? What does one do to mobilize those decent, honorable citizens who want to work hard and contribute, but they don't want to start a business, take a loan, take the risk, fail 4 times and get up again, but nevertheless, they have a contribution to make? What's their space and how does one inspire and mobilize them and get them working in this puzzle?
Without being entrepreneurs, but endorsing entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Well, first, to be part of the job market, to see that they are able to participate in the wealth creation. Because I think that is also to have job opportunities and to see that people are participating. And I think the understanding about what creates wealth, and also to see that we need both. We need people to employ, and we need people that are researchers and everything else, and bureaucrats as well. We need stable institutions, as was said, but also how this goes together. And I think in many economies now, if we're talking about changing the culture, we have to honor those that are taking the risks. Not perhaps that they can earn a lot of money, but they have to be recognized as local heroes, as was mentioned here in some of the cities of UK. And I think that is also a little bit of having some politicians to step down a little bit, because they sometimes claim that they are creating the wealth. They are actually creating the enabling environment.
Sure.
So I think if the problem was Mitt Romney or the lack of entrepreneurship, I don't know. But I think one has to think profoundly about this, because otherwise we will lose out all these that are actually taking the risk because they think perhaps it's not worth it. At least we have tried to think about that back home in Sweden.
So part of the problem, if I hear you correctly, is public education for who plays what role and where wealth creation comes from.
Yes, but also that in some societies there is such a tiny layer of entrepreneurs so that they have become a minority. I mean, we have had that trend in Sweden. When I grew up, in my class there were quite a lot of kids, children of entrepreneurs, but many of them in my generation didn't end up as entrepreneurs. And now we have a reverse trend that more and more young people are going to become entrepreneurs again. And I must say that during the 60s, 70s and 80s in Sweden, it was not so nice to be an entrepreneur in Sweden. It was the public perception that they were tax evasion, that they were not contributing good enough, and that they were earning too much money. So it's also not only about how politicians portray entrepreneurs, it's also about the media, it's about how we all respect and to see that this is also part of a thriving society, and to find the balance. And that's why I think the more entrepreneurs, the better, because then we have enough people that are driving this, in order also to see that it's not too hard to become an entrepreneur, that the thresholds are lower. Because I think for the future, as there are so many, because I still argue that entrepreneurs are solving problems and see opportunities. And I think there is a lot of problems out there, and that's why we will need more entrepreneurs in the years to come. And many of them could be micro-entrepreneurs, as Reuben pointed out. Most of those that are solving problems are rather small people that are doing big things. And that's why I think we have to have the right attitude here. And that goes for, as well as developing countries as so-called developed. And that's why I think politicians have to owe some thinking on this. But when you're in government, you're also fond of being in government. So you're only thinking big governance. And I think that's sometimes the problem. And also now, the trends for nationals, and sorry for being so lengthy, but I've been highly inspired tonight. It is that we see the trends today that we need to go much more local in decision making to make people participate and to feel that they belong to something and understand local democracy, but also local economy, as well as global economy and global democracy. And that is the problem today for the national states, to cope with both these two trends.
Thank you. Guy, final thoughts your side?
A couple of things, I suppose. We need good institutions to create entrepreneurship. We need the rule of law, property rights, all those things we talked about earlier. And in my own view, we need small government. So I think it's ultimately the government has to set things up in a friendly way to enable entrepreneurship, and then get out of the way and let the people create the wealth. And they will then employ the rest of our people, who will be taxed less, who will take more of their pay home, because the state is smaller, and everyone will be happy.
Reuben, you get the last word.
Well, I mean, I just want to just pick up on what he just said. I mean, which is, I just caveat the small government piece, which is that what you actually need is a very strong government that is very narrow. The problem is when a weak government tries to do too many things. So, I mean, Ed Glazer has this great line about, a government that cannot provide drinking water to its people should not be in the business of censoring books. So, find a limited number of things, but what you actually need is very strong government, but in a limited number of areas. So that would sort of be my, but I mean, to anybody who wants to do research, I mean, I would certainly say, think about the political entrepreneur bit of this, because I mean, that to me is a strange puzzle as to where these people come from and why they come from, where they come from, why they come, what are they trying to, I mean, I would love to get into Deng Xiaoping's head and figure out what is he trying to solve for. I mean, I mean, just think about what that man has achieved. It is mind-boggling.
We will leave it there. Read this paper. It's mind-boggling. It's by Reuben Abraham. It's Learning by Doing, Entrepreneurship in Developing Countries. So to those who join us via live streaming, we cannot invite you to a glass of wine. Come to the Legatum Institute as soon as possible. But thank you for joining. Everybody else on the lower ground level, please join us for reception, and join me in thanking a great panel.